Yesterday we started talking about the laws of the Eved Ivri. The Eved Ivri we said was a Hebrew slave who was bought for 6 years. Now what happens is the Eved Ivri is stolen, and unlike contemporary society, so the Eved Ivri is not sent to prison. Nowadays they send a guy to prison, he just becomes a bigger criminal. A guy can't pay, he steals, he goes to prison, he becomes a bigger criminal. The Eved Ivri is sold to another Jew. Part of the idea here is that we want him to see that you could live as a good Jew without having to steal. And he could live with a good, God-fearing, Torah-observant Jew. And he could learn how to be a God-fearing, Torah-observant Jew. Instead of hanging around with criminals for a few years, he could be in a Torah environment for a few years. And that's one of the ideas behind it. Now, one of the strange laws here is that the Eved Ivri is allowed to live with a Shifcha Knainis. A Shifcha Knainis means a non-Jewish maidservant. So if the owner has a non-Jewish maidservant, he is allowed to have the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew servant, which is really better called a Hebrew hired hand, because it's essentially what he is. And he's there for 6 years. If after 6 years he gets the option of having his ear drilled, and then going and staying till the Yovel, which is for the 49th year. Now, part of the idea of giving him the Torah relaxes the rules, and this is always a rule in Torah itself. Sometimes people ask, well, how could we kill a Malek? Isn't murder prohibited? How can you push a goat off a cliff on Yom Kippur? Isn't that a violation of cruelty to animals? How could the Levites be shaved entirely if you're not allowed to shave with a razor? How could a brother marry his brother's wife and do yibum if marrying your brother's wife is prohibited? And like over here, how could you live with a non-Jewish woman if marrying a non-Jewish woman is prohibited? The answer is, well, how could a knight jump on a chessboard if no other piece could jump on a chessboard? The answer is that whoever made the rule said this is an exception to the rule. So if God said, well, you're not allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman, God didn't just say, you're not allowed to marry a non-Jewish. God said you're not allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman unless you're an Eved Ivri who's living with the Shifcha Knainis. Right? You're not allowed to be cruel to animals unless it's the goat that's being pushed off the cliff on Yom Kippur, and so on and so forth, because the same God that made the rules is the one who made the rules. So he tells you when the rule is, when there's an exception. That's the basic answer. Here, it's still strange. Why would the Eved Ivri be allowed to live with a Shifcha Knainis? And even stranger is that he's only allowed to live with her and then produce slaves, because the slaves go after the mother, the children go after the mother. He's only allowed to live with her if he's married. If he's single, he's not allowed to live with her. It's strange, almost counterintuitive. You'd think that if he's married, he can't. If he's single, he could. Anybody got an idea? Why do you think that he's allowed to at all, and why only if he's married?
Because if he's married, he's bound to his significant other. He wouldn't have any inclination to sleep with.
But he's allowed to. To the contrary, the master could give him the Shifcha Knainis, and he could live with her and produce slaves.
Because he's fulfilling his mitzvah already with his wife.
He's fulfilling his mitzvah already with his wife. Therefore, what? Therefore, what? I mean, okay, so he's fulfilling the mitzvah. The other guy hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. What's the difference? The other guy will fulfill the mitzvah when he gets married. So to a certain extent, you're right. To a certain extent, we don't want that his first relationship should be with a non-Jewish maidservant, number one. Number two, there are actually commentaries that say that there's a certain punishment to his wife, because if a man steals, it's generally because his wife made him live at a higher financial level than he could. And it's one of the commentators actually brings that down, that it's a punishment to his wife, because probably his wife pressured him and he had no choice but to go steal money. But those aren't the main reasons. Those are secondary reasons. The main reason here is, you see, that we're going to take a guy and we're going to sell him. Now, if he's a nice single yeshiva bacher, if I say, well, Eliasaf is for sale, you could have him on your property for 6 years, he could help you build a sukkah, mow your lawn, wash your car, do all that stuff. What does it cost your room and board? Okay, that's a good deal. Have an extra pair of hands around the house. You know what? He can sit up at night and do guard duty at the house. That's not a bad duty. And if you really want, he could entertain you with his banjo over there. You can sing Western music. About how you love your horse. I love my horse. Of course. That's why we got divorced. Whatever the way you call it is. So you're into the country and Western, right? That's probably who you really are deep down inside. So what do you call it? So you don't need any incentive to buy a single guy. But the halacha is that if the slave moves in and he's married and has children, you have to support them as well. Now, why in your right mind would I want to take on the support of a family of 8 just for the benefit of having this guy living on my property to build a sukkah? It's not worth it to me. So the Torah says, you know what, there's a financial incentive. Because if you have a non-Jewish maidservant, he could produce children for you. And then you own them, and in a slave trade world, the children, the little slaves are worth money, and apparently based on the financial reality of the times, it was actually worthwhile, and it offset the expenses of keeping him. And so it's really an incentive. You don't need an incentive to buy somebody. You don't need an incentive to go, if David is for sale, we'll take him. We could ice up our rink. He could do the icing of the rink, so that or anything else that the Canadians do. I don't know if they do anything else, but that's one of the things they could do. So so why not buy him, and then you could go skating? Yeah,
You sharpen skates too.
You sharpen skates too, right? There you go. That's also a professional. What do you call it? Go ahead, Mr. Mr. Fogel. What were you going to ask?
No, you said if he comes in as an evan with a wife and kids.
You have to support him.
I mean, a Jewish wife.
A Jewish wife and kids. You have to support him, and only then is he allowed to live with a non. That's exactly why the Torah creates the incentive. The Torah says we know you won't unless there's a financial incentive. The financial incentive is he could produce slaves for you. He could produce slaves for you.
Well, let's say he has children with a shifter.
They are slaves.
And they stay with the balabas.
They stay with the balabas. The balabas and the balabas could sell them. He could do whatever he wants to them. Whatever the laws in a slave society are, that's what he's allowed to do. And that's the financial incentive. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. No balabas is going to want to take on the support of an entire family. So then the guy, after 6 years, the guy may want to stay longer because he's got room and board. His family's being cared for. He doesn't have to pay bills. He doesn't have any particular worries. It's like living on kibbutz. And therefore, he decides that he wants to stay for 49 years. So then they drill his ear. And the idea of the drilling of the ear was that the Torah says he heard the command at Sinai that he should be a servant to God and not to anybody else. And he chose willingly now to be a servant for the second term. So we drill his ear. And the symbol of it is the ear is drilled while he's standing against a door. It is drilled into the door. And that's where I think they get the idea of an indentured servant, by the way, the idea of an indentured servant. The idea of the door is that this guy is showing that he believes that the doorway to Parnassa is closed to him. He believes that he doesn't have a chance to make a living. That's why he wants to stay with somebody else who will support him, which means there's a flaw in his basic bitachon level. This guy does not have the bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the necessary trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Therefore, he's like, that's halacha. Now, there's an extension of this, because the Gomorrah says like this. I want to go somewhere else with this completely. The Gomorrah says like this. The Gomorrah, when describing, pay attention carefully, the Gomorrah, when describing the servant's job at the man, the Gomorrah says, an Eved Ivri serves his master by day and at night. During the day he works, and at night he produces slaves for the master. That's the Gomorrah's description. An Eved Ivri serves the master by day and by night. Okay. One of the commentaries, the Nesivos Shalom, was one of the contemporary, he was the Rabbi of the Slonimer Hasidim. Massive Talmud Chacham. He was on the Moetzes Chachmei Torah. So the Nesivos Shalom says like this. Every Jew is an Eved Ivri. Every one of us is an Eved Ivri. Because ultimately our job in life is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So every one of us is an Eved Ivri. Now, daytime always means, daytime is when things are good. Sun is shining, everybody's in a good mood. To serve God by day, and Eved Ivri serves the master by day and at night, means that the ultimate, the Jewish servant, which is every one of us, we serve the master during the day, we serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu during the day, when things are going well, when things are going easy, but we also serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu at night when things aren't going so easy. When a person's in the Holocaust, in a concentration camp, and he figures out a way to light a Hanukkah menorah, or to eat matzahs by smuggling matzahs in, that's serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu at night. Anybody could serve during the day. I had a Rebbe who once said, anybody could learn Torah when they feel like learning. The trick is to learn even when you don't feel like learning. Anybody can do it when you feel like doing it. We're all great when we feel well and it's a job we enjoy doing. You know, if my wife ever asks me to do something in the house which I enjoy doing, can you taste the Erev Shabbos food? Twist my arm, somebody, I'll have to do it again, all right. And when it comes to doing Motzei Shabbos dishes, which between me and you, oh, this is on film. I haven't done it in about 25 years. But if it's Motzei Shabbos, dishes, I was good at it. My wife just didn't like the fact that I was trying to save money by not using soap on the dishes. People always tell you drop the first dish when you're married. That's a mistake. It's going to cost you money. Why cost money? Save money. Don't use soap. And then eventually your wife is going to say to you, here, let me do it. But it's clean. Look at this. And she doesn't. She generally won't go for that. And then eventually you're off duty. But when you have to do something difficult, here they got me scheduled in England. I'm going to England in a few weeks. So there's going to be a talk on the same night as the World Cup final. I told them this is a really bad idea. It's supposed to be for couples, for young couples. So I said this is a really bad idea. Even though England will not be in the World Cup final, or very unlikely, in England, in any European country for the World Cup final, this is a mistake. Now, there are going to be homes there's going to cause a conflict, because the wife is going to say to the husband, let's go to the Shir by Rabbi Kaplan. And the husband is going to say something like, well, I like Rabbi Kaplan, but I like Messi a whole lot more. And therefore, we will not be going to the Shir. And, the wife will say, well, that's what tape delays are for. And the husband's going to say, oh, I didn't know they could tape the Shir. Then that's what's going to happen. So now that's going to be a situation where it's going to be difficult for a husband. And the husband has to say, that's a difficult job. That's serving by night. That's serving by night. Now you're going to have to give in to your wife. You're going to have to go, you're going to have to go. You understand? Anybody could do it when it's fun. The trick is to do it when it's not fun. So I've always advised couples, those of you who are married or are planning on getting married, it is very important to, when a couple has a disagreement at night, this is important for the young fellows. The older fellows probably worked this out already. The young fellows, you will always hear people will tell you, never go to sleep angry. Work it out before you go to sleep. It's a big mistake. One of the big mistakes you can make. Because what happens is if you're angry at night and you're talking about it, you're cranky, she's cranky, and everybody it takes you 3 hours and you have a slugfest, and you eventually say something which you really regret, right? It feels good when you say it, but you'll eventually really regret it. And what happens is that it just makes things worse. If the couple would just say, look, we're upset, we're cranky, we're tired, let's go to sleep. Then you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden everything, in 10 minutes it's all worked out. You're in a better mood, you feel refreshed. The sun is shining, everything is good. Then you'll eventually probably make a mistake and say something like, yeah, it's so silly how I let you get me upset last night. Then you're right back off to the races. So I have pulled a line on my wife where it's my turn. You got to be careful. You got to be selective. I've said to her, well, I'm really, I have to apologize. You always have to, the men always have to apologize. It's like, I apologize for letting you get me upset. Okay, what? Then head out the door, quick, and come back 2 weeks later. But at the end of the day, daylight is always when things are good, and nighttime is when things are difficult. We always call it night. I think Elie Wiesel, the first book Elie Wiesel wrote was called Night. Right. Night, and we even see that Yaakov Avinu wrestles the Gullus is called night. Yaakov Avinu, the Gullus is called night. And if you remember in the Megillas Rus, I don't know if you learned a little bit about the Megillas Rus on Shavuos, Rus comes to Boaz to propose marriage. It's in the dead of night. It's in the dead of night. And the commentaries say that on the one hand, it's what the Megillah is trying to teach us is we could be at the darkest point of night, which is midnight. And at the darkest point of night, the seeds of Mashiach are being planted, which is what comes from Boaz and Rus. So the night is always when things are difficult. So I met a guy a few years back. I got into a cab here in Israel, and the guy is wearing a little yarmulke, and we're driving along. And I think there was a driver. I think it was an Arab. He kind of cut us off in a very irresponsible way. So I made a crack about Arabs. So the guy turns to me and says, "I know them a little better than you do." So I smell the story coming. That's always I say, and why so? So he told me in 1973 he was on the Golan Heights. His unit was on the Golan Heights at the beginning of the 73 war. They were overrun by the Syrians. The entire unit was wiped out except for him and 7 other guys. And they were taken into captivity. He told me they were in captivity for a year, 6 months, and 3 days by the Syrians. And the Syrians tortured them. They tortured them physically, electric shocks, things like that. Then he said they also tortured them psychologically because they said that Israel has been destroyed and you're never going to see your family again. And he had no way of knowing otherwise because he saw his whole unit wiped out and they were overrunning the Golan. That was the last that he saw. And he met one person from the Red Cross came 3 weeks after his taking in captivity, and that was it. So he was in solitary and beatings, everything else. Okay. In the meantime, Israel and Syria had worked out a prisoner exchange, which this guy didn't know about. It was these 8 guys for about, 1,500 Syrian prisoners, whatever it was. It was after a year and a half. And one day they call him out. Now the Syrians knew that there was a prisoner exchange, but they didn't tell these guys. So they walked into his cell. They took him into a room. They cut open his back with a commando knife with no anesthesia, and they inserted a tracking device. And they stitched up. He didn't know what they were doing. They stitched him up, all without anesthesia. And they put him in a cell, and 3 days later, because they knew that he was going to go back in the exchange, they wanted to be able to track him in the Israel, where he goes in Israel, because they knew that he was going to go be an Israeli military base. So 3 days later, they came into his cell, and they said, okay, put on your clothes, you're going home, 15 minutes. Right? Just like that. Okay. So he goes back to Israel, they had surgery, they removed the device. This was 30 years later. I was in 2003. I remember it was exactly 30 years later. The guy says to me he's been in pain for 30 years. His back's been bothering him for 30 years from the procedure. The Israelis obviously took it out properly. He says his back's bothering him. He never got a dime in government reparations. Didn't get anything. And the Israelis do not treat returning prisoners of war as heroes. To the contrary, they treat them with a certain amount of derision, because the feeling is, you should have died rather than be taken captive. You should have fought. You should have fought till you died. They say he got no reparations. He's driving a cab, but the guy davens 3 times a day. The guy davens 3 times a day. That means that the guy is serving, listen, okay, your faith has been tested. You're right, your faith has been tested. But that's what it means to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu by day and by night. That's the idea. So person, anytime, it's a lesson in life. We always, when you feel good and everything's going well, it's great. But sometimes you have a headache, and sometimes you don't feel well, and sometimes you don't feel like doing the mitzvah. The word I want or I don't want is not a real valid expression in serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So for example, I heard a story about a guy sits down to the supper table, and there's a knock at the door. Some guy's asking for tzedakah. So the man gets up to go give him some money. So his wife says to him, but you just sat down to dinner. You just sat down to dinner. So he says to his wife, listen, there's a halacha that you're not allowed to stop in the middle of Shemona Esrei. And there's a halacha that says you're not allowed to stop in the middle of Kriya Shema. I don't know of any halacha that says I'm not allowed to stop in the middle of supper. I don't know of any halacha that says you're not allowed to for your supper to go to the door and give the guy tzedakah. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, but 1 second, it depends, but I want to eat in peace. Okay, there's the I want word. Okay, we know what you want. I know what you want. We all want that. We all want a lot of things. So you want it, so what? But, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu would like you to do something else. So it's not what you want for his way. We always tell kids, you can't live life with what you want. You got to live with what your responsibility as well. And, that's our responsibility. And a mitzvah done with difficulty is worth 100 times as a mitzvah done without any difficulty. And a mitzvah done with joy, if I'm not mistaken, there's a source that says that it's worth 1,000 times the mitzvah done without joy. So if you do a difficult mitzvah with joy, so you're getting something like, 100,000 times or 10,000 times as much as the same exact mitzvah without any challenge whatsoever. Of course it's difficult. So it's difficult. So what? A lot of things are difficult. It's difficult. Okay, that's when you have to do it. You have to do it when it's difficult. Tov echad b'tzar mimei shel b'tzar. That's what the Gemara says. If you learn Torah for an hour when you have a headache, you just learn for 100 hours. Yet reward is if you learn for 100 hours, because you learned when it was difficult. If you learn, you're a little tired at night and you push yourself, so now you get scarred for learning Torah at night when it was difficult. That's what the bit says. There was another story here. There's a couple. Listen, this is an incredible story. A couple got married, and 3 months after the marriage, the husband they were in a car accident. 3 months they're married. Husband in a car accident. The husband had his brainstem shattered, and he turned into a vegetable. He was in the hospital on a respirator. Everybody's sitting around, waiting. His wife came in. The doctor said there's no hope. He's going to be a vegetable they wanted to pull him off the machine. The family said he can't take him off the machine. Okay. So the wife would come in every day to sit with the husband, nothing, and eventually she'd come in once a week, and time started passing, and she realized that this could go on for a while. She's an aguna at this point, not in a literal sense, but she doesn't have a real husband, and she can't remarry because he's still alive. Okay. She decided in the meantime she's going to go to medical school. Make a career for herself. She went to medical school, and while she was going through medical school, once a week she would come and sit with her husband for 10 minutes and leave. And she goes, she graduated medical school, she already started working as a doctor, and once a week she'd come in and visit with her husband. All right. So one day she's sitting there, And in the middle of the visit, she sees signs, because of her medical training, she sees he's having a heart attack. And she realized she's got two choices. She can either let him die, and be released from this prison that she's been in for a number of years, or she could push the button, apply CPR, and keep him alive. Okay? So without a moment's hesitation, she pushes the button, they get help, CPR, they keep him alive. Then she went to a posek, they asked, was she obligated to do that? Was she obligated to make the effort to keep him alive? So the posek said to her that the Torah says that you're not allowed to stand by idly while a fellow Jew is dying. Torah does not make a distinguish whether or not he's healthy, he's not healthy. There are certain situations where you don't have to get involved. For whatever the reason, here the posek said she had to have gotten involved. And after she did it, the posek said to her, no one whose ancestors did not stand at Sinai would have possibly been able to have done what you did. That was now, years ago, I told this to my kids at Shalom Shidduch. This is one of those NCSY tearjerker Shalom Shidduch stories, and it always ends with, and that girl was me. It always ends with one of those. So I told this to my kids at Shalom Shidduch, and my mother was over. And I told it to the kids. The kids were very young at the time. The kids were maybe, I think the oldest one was maybe about 9, 10 years old. And I finished telling the kids the story, and they're looking at me like this. And my mother looks at me from across. She goes, and then... I just got up off the table, they lived happily ever after, and that was what she wanted because the kids should get spooked. So I said, no, there was no happy ending here. The ending itself is the happy ending. It's not the happy ending that we would have written for the script. The happy ending of the story is that there's a Jew who's willing to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to do. That's the happy ending of the story. There is no happy ending. My mother was not happy with me, right? Because she didn't want the kids to get freaked out. But I felt it's an important lesson. Sometimes in life you got to do things that are difficult. Your mother ever say to you, if you're going to do it with a smile? You ever hear that music? If you're going to do it. I never said that to my kids. My wife said it once in a while. She even didn't say it too much, but I never said it to them. I said, guys, all right, listen, you got to fold the laundry. No, and I start fetching. I said, look, you can do it happily or do it not happily. Either way, we got to have clean. Laundry's got to be folded. You want to smile, smile. You don't want to smile, don't smile. I couldn't care less. Just fold the laundry. Because mothers also aren't always smiling. My wife is, mother. Oh, good, I get to do laundry now. Mothers aren't always smiling. So it's an unreasonable expectation, but you got to do it. If you could get yourself to do it with a smile, if you get yourself to do it, then you get even more reward because you're taking on something difficult and you're doing it in an upbeat manner. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah.
When it comes to honoring your mother, mitzvah of honoring your mother and father, if you have a parent who says that if I look like I'm dead, don't try and help me, do you not do it?
All you have to do is ask a posek what the halacha is. In all these situations, if a parent gives an order, because the halacha is clear, that you're not allowed to do anything against the halacha. Your parents can't tell you to do anything against halacha. I heard a story about a couple that was married, and a husband said to his wife, if I'm ever dependent on a machine, I want you to pull the plug. I don't want you. And the wife said to him, "Are you absolutely sure?" He said, "Yeah, if I'm dependent on a machine, I want you to pull the plug." So the wife said, "Okay." She got up, walked across the room, and plugged the plug on the television. If what do you call it? Any of these shilas go straight to a posek. You don't touch this with the 10-foot pole. You go straight to a posek. What people want and what the halacha wants. So if the posek says, "Yeah, listen, there's an option over here," if that's what you pray. What's that thing called? A do not resuscitate. What's it called? A DNR? A DNR. So somebody just told me a story recently. They asked his mother if she wants a DNR. She said, a frum woman. She said, "What are you asking me? Ask a posek." Ask a posek. It's not my decision. I live my life according to halacha. Whatever the posek says, that's what we're going to do. What's it got to do with what I want? Same thing if parents want to be cremated or anything. You have to do everything you can not to. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't help it because the law is on their side. But if you have the option, then you go against their request. There's a story with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein when he was the Rav of Luban. So there was a Jewish informer. There was a guy who had caused a lot of aggravation. They used to have what they call a malshin. These guys were informers. They would inform on Jews to the government. They would get paid, and Jews would lose property, sometimes go to prison. And this guy gave the Jewish community a very, very hard time. So when the guy died, he left in his last request. He wants to be buried face down. And the halacha is you bury somebody face up. He wanted to be buried face down. So they asked Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, because on one hand, there's an obligation to carry out the will of the deceased. On his deathbed, there's what's called divrei shchiv mira. When a person's on his deathbed, so he dies knowing that whatever he asks for will be carried out. It's as if it's been given an order, like a military order. On the other hand, not if it contravenes halacha. So yesterday he left, and there's a Chaver Kadisha said the guy asked to be buried face down. Rav Moshe Feinstein said, sorry, we can't do that because the halacha says he's buried face up. You're going to have to ignore the tzava. Okay, so they bury the guy face up. The next day, the Russian authorities come. I said, where did you bury him? So they take him out of the cemetery. I said, okay, dig up the grave. They said, what's going on? They said, look, he told us that you hated him so much, that the community hated so much that you were going to degrade him when you buried him by burying him face down. I dig him up, right? And you dig him up and he's face up. I said, okay, we just want to tell you, had he been face down, the entire community would have suffered severe consequences. So Moshe Feinstein said, you see that when you carry out the halacha, so you do what you have to do. Let HaKadosh Baruch Hu run his world. I just saw a very interesting story. Did you ever hear of Rav Zalman Meltzer? Rav Zalman Meltzer was Rav Aaron Kotler's father-in-law. Was a tremendous Talmid Chacham. Lives here in Yerushalayim. Now he had a problem. When he was young, I think he had tuberculosis or something, and then they wanted to make a shidduch with him. He was one of the star pupils from Volozhin. So they went to the Chafetz Chaim. The parents of the Kala went to the Chafetz Chaim, and they asked the Chafetz Chaim, should our daughter marry this guy? He's been very, very sick. So Chafetz Chaim said, some people are healthy, and some people are healthy, and some people live long. So they understood that the Chafetz Chaim was saying, go ahead. Rav Zalman was 83 when he was nifter. Okay, so now, part of what he needed goat's milk, because for his lungs, apparently he needed fresh goat's milk every day. That was one of the treatments for lungs, whatever it was. In the 48 war, they were living here in Israel, and they couldn't get a hold of goat's milk, so they had to get cow's milk. And the cow's milk then had to be cooked. Now what happens is, did you ever hear the idea of something called mayim megulim? Mayim megulim means water that's been left uncovered, a liquid that's been left uncovered. So the Gomorrah says, liquid that's been left uncovered for the amount of time, in other words, they're unattended and uncovered, and you walked out of the room, you should not drink that liquid. Because in the time of the Gomorrah, there was a concern that snakes might have gotten to it and injected venom in it. So if it was left unattended, the amount of time a snake could have gotten to it, so then you don't drink it. Okay? Now, that halacha was then rescinded. Nowadays, you do not have to be concerned for that, because nowadays, most places, they don't have snakes. However, the Vilna Gaon writes that there is room to be stringent. The Vilna Gaon was stringent because rabbinic decrees had more than one reason. There was the revealed reason for the rabbinic decree, and there are hidden reasons for the rabbinic decrees as well. Rav Zalman Meltzer was machmir. He was stringent, that anything that's left uncovered, you don't, he doesn't drink. Okay, so they got a hold of this cow's milk, and his wife had it, and she was going to boil it up, and she had to run out of the room for a second. She comes back in there, and she goes, oi, I left it unattended, and it was uncovered. See, if it's covered, you can tell the snakes aren't going to knock a plate off and then put the plate back on for you. So if it's covered, then it's fine. So his wife says, now what am I going to do? I got a dilemma. He needs to drink the cow's milk, but he doesn't drink mayim megulim. He doesn't drink the water if the water's uncovered. Okay, so she does it. She goes back and forth. She goes, under the circumstances, I think I'm going to have to, I just won't tell him. Finished. So she takes the milk, she puts it on the stove to boil up the milk. In the meantime, the doorbell rings. She goes over the door, and there's a poor man asking for money. So while she's getting money for the poor man, the milk burnt on the stove, and the vapor filled up the house where Visser Zalman started coughing because that was bad for his lungs. So he calls his wife, Bela Hinda. She comes running in. She says, yeah. He says, what happened? He says, well, the milk was on the stove, and I went to the door to do a mitzvah, and the milk burnt. So he said to her, milk doesn't burn because you do a mitzvah. Milk burns because you do an aveira. That's why milk burns. It doesn't burn from mitzvahs. It burns from aveiras. It's an important lesson in life. Oh, I did a mitzvah that really cost. It'll never cost you. And if you did the mitzvah and things didn't work out, it would have been worse if you would have done the aveira. So Moshe Feinstein was saying, just do it the way the halacha says. That's what happens as far as the bearing. So that applies to everything. Whenever somebody says to do something against halacha. Okay. The next mitzvah is that when a man sells his daughter, a man is allowed to sell his daughter according to halacha when she is a minor. Now, it's a very strange halacha. Oh, you sell your daughter? and you're allowed to sell her as a shifcha, as a maidservant. And when you sell her, there is a specific mitzvah, and that's what this mitzvah is, that the owner who buys her, either he or his son should marry her. Either the person who bought her or his son should marry the girl that you've sold, your daughter that you've sold. All right, obviously, the question is, who in their right mind is going to go selling their daughter? All right, who would sell a daughter? Who do you think would sell a daughter? What's that? Someone very poor. In other words, it's the lesser of two evils. What do you want? You got a daughter who's starving in your home, and you could actually sell her to somebody where she'll be taken care of as a maidservant, and in the best scenario, somebody will marry her. And the Torah says, obviously, no father is going to go sell his daughter, although I did threaten my daughter like that once. My 7-year-old daughter once was giving me some cheek, which she always did, and at a certain point, I said to her, according to halacha, I could sell you, don't you? And she looked at me and she says, yeah, but you won't, right? So that was the end of the discussion. I had to keep her. So, but I've gotten her back in other ways. I can't say because I could get arrested. The other day, I wrote a note for my daughter. I wrote in Hebrew, private, and I wrote my son's name on it. And I stapled it together. There were 2 sheets. The top sheet said private with my son's name on it. And underneath on the second paper, I just wrote her name. I said, Plonis, why are you looking at this if this said private for him? Right? So I got her good and proper. She said, oh, Daddy, that was really good. She had no choice but to admit the truth. So the only one who will sell a daughter, is somebody who's desperately poor. Now, listen carefully. The Torah says that if the father sells the daughter, and the daughter, the owner of, or the son, do not marry her, so then the halacha is that they are not allowed to resell her. They're not allowed to resell her because they have failed in what they're supposed to do. They failed in what they're supposed to do. They're not allowed to resell her. She's not something that's going to be, the father sold to specific people. If she is not married by them, then she goes back to the father. Now, what's interesting is that in halacha it says a father could marry off his daughter even when she's a katana also. He can marry her off. He could accept Kiddushin money for her when she's a katana. The Gomorrah in Kiddushin says that a man should not do so, even though it's permissible and it's binding according to halacha. In other words, if I say to you, okay, you give me a ring or give me money and say Harayat Mekudeshli, my daughter was now bound to you, and you could do that. Theoretically, in halacha, you could do that. The Gemara says, although it works, don't do it. Wait till she gets older. And she says, Ploni Ani Rotza, I let her select the husband. Okay? Then Tosos says something enchanting. Tosos says, and nowadays, the words of Tosos and Kiddushin on page 41a, Tosos says, nowadays that we do accept Kiddushin for our daughters even when they're minors is because in each day, the exile is getting more intense. And therefore, if a man has a dowry, he's able to afford a dowry, let him marry off his daughter when he's able to afford to, because from one day to the next, you don't know if you're going to have the money. Now, gentlemen, it's very interesting. What era was Tosos talking about? Where was Tosos living? The Bali Tosos, the members of the schools, you know where they were living? They were living in France and Germany. And in the 12 and 1300s. So what do you think they were talking about? The Crusades. Talking about the Crusades. The Crusades was the exile, and they would ride in and they would, pillage the Jewish village in the best scenario. There are heartbreaking stories of decisions that had to be made. There were several cities that committed mass suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Crusaders. The Crusade of Mercy, that's one of the great misnomers of history. It's almost as good as Pope Pius, right? Who wasn't, and the Crusaders would ride through. So there was one heartbreaking story where the community, the Crusaders were coming, and the community, there was an argument among the Rabbanim, and they voted that the community should commit a mass suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Crusaders and be a forced conversion. And so they did. They converted. There was a mass suicide. And then the Crusaders never came. They turned away, went to a different city. So there were so many cities that were slaughtered. We even have on Tisha B'Av, we have certain kinos, laments that are said the cities of Speyer, Germiza, I think. There were 3 cities over there where the Crusaders went in and wiped them out. So the Torah is saying there are circumstances where a father is allowed to sell his daughter, but that's only if she is, what do you call it? If he's poor, only a father who's got a daughter who's poor is going to do such a thing. If the daughter is not, otherwise the father is not going to do so. Okay, now tomorrow we're going to speak, the next mitzvah is just very quickly that if she offers to buy her way out, the owner should allow her to buy her way out. If somehow she comes across money, and because the Torah wants us to be compassionate and merciful, tomorrow we're going to do a very important mitzvah. They're all mitzvah important, but when I say it's important, it means on a personal level. There's a lot of application to this mitzvah about what happens if the owner does not marry her. We'll see a tremendous amount of personal connection to every one of us in what we're trying to accomplish. All right.